All right. So obviously I'm not there today. Cameron got sick, and so I got to take care of him tomorrow. It's what 8:23 p.m. Like it's pretty late, so that's why I kind of look like this. I'm in my office at home, stuff like that. All right. So let's rip through this. All right. I'm going to actually have a second Google Forms that if you would like me to fill out or like me to kind of talk about real briefly on Thursday, I can. All right. So that's going to be posted as well. So let's dive into this. All right, method of studying biodiversity. So you can do biodiversity in a couple different ways. So you can do it simply by species, like how many species there are, like how many different types of trees, how many different types of birds, how many different types of insects and grasses and plants or whatever. That kind of species diversity. Or you could focus in on a population, talk about their genetic diversity. Like with humans, we got blonde hair versus red hair versus black hair. We got people that are tall and people that are short, and so on, so on, so on. That's genetic variation. Another type of biodiversity we can talk about is ecosystem diversity. So, North America, we got the grasslands, we got the desert, and we got the tropical rainforest and the temperate rainforest, and like all those kind of different things. That's ecosystem diversity. That's one of the things we can do. Answer number 4 on the progress checks. Number 4 is right here. So, based on the data shown in the graph, which of the following best describes how ecologists could determine when this system is approaching a climax community? Now, a climax community is basically a community that, like, there's not much change occurring. Like think about like a wildfire rips through and the kind of the whole system just kind of like resets itself and kind of like starts growing back. Climax community is like where everything starts to become pretty stable. So like Olympic National Forest, that's a climax community. There's not much change happening from one year to the next, or honestly from one decade to the next. It's pretty stable. So if you can record the number and type of producers present every year after the eruption, that's the thing. All right. So there's some bunch of different options. So the biomass of the pioneer species, but the pioneer species, remember, that's the beginning. Pioneer, that's the first guy. Determine if the keystone species in the ecosystem is present at 2 years after the volcanic eruption. They might be, but that whole system hasn't reset itself in 2 years. Last one, calculate the net primary productivity of specific indicator species. Indicator species, that's more like if they're going down, it's kind of like showing like maybe like a nitrogen deficiency. That's what an indicator is like for one specific thing. That's their job. So record the number and type of producers. That's kind of the guys that kind of like stabilize the whole thing. All righty, next one, convergent evolution. So convergent evolution, I wish I could draw, but basically convergent evolution, when you start with two things that are not related at all, you put them in the same environment, they start to converge. They start to kind of like become more and more and more similar to one another. Easy examples in the Caribbean, they studied the lizards and the geckos down there. Those guys aren't related at all. Like if you look at their DNA, they have no common ancestor besides like way, 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 way back when. Everything's related. But those guys aren't related, but put them in the same environment, same temperature, same tree species. So they're starting to become more similar, like the coloration, the length of their tail, the how many fingers they have, the way that they can climb up trees because their fingers are sticky and stuff like that. All right, can you explain niche more example with or niche more in depth with examples, please? So a niche, remember, is its job in the ecosystem. So an example would be like think of Darwin's finches. There's the ones that eat watermelon. They eat the seeds, or excuse me, the fruit of the watermelon. That could be one of them. Then another one, they eat mangoes. So those are niches. That's its job. Watermelon, mangoes. This guy eats seeds. This guy eats insects. Kind of like everybody's kind of got their little role and their little job in the ecosystem. And when there's a lot of biodiversity, there's a lot of niche organisms because the competition is fierce. And so you got to be really good at your one thing so that way you can survive. Because if you're good at everything, that means you're not good at a lot of stuff. But if you're really good at one thing, you're going to be like the expert in that one thing. You're going to outcompete everybody. Carrying capacity in question 2. So question, okay, so there are two different things. So carrying capacity, I think, is basically right here. Honestly, that's kind of graph can work. So as the graph goes up, you see how it starts to kind of like level off? That leveling off there, that's a carrying capacity. So like if you have too many, like in this example, if you have too many harbor seals, there's not enough food for them, so they die off and this will dive back down. But there's enough food, so they kind of go back up, and then they kind of back and forth and back and forth. I'm not sure if you guys remember the predator-prey relationships. Carrying capacity normally isn't something that just like sits there and just like stays the same number from year to year to year to year to year. because some years there's more food, some years there's less food. It's kind of like an average over time. That's what the carrying capacity is. The number 2 starts with some information here. So 1 hectare of pond is sampled in early September. The sample yields 1 small catfish as well as 17 benthic invertebrates that represent 10 species. So if the pond is resampled a year later, which of the following would best indicate that the pond has been adversely affected by adjacent development? So adversely, side note, means bad. All right, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for something to show that it's been bad on the pond itself. So number 1, an uncommon species that become more numerous. That's not necessarily bad. They're not talking about an invasive species. They're just talking about an uncommon one. So you can't determine whether that's good or bad. An increase in the low tolerance species had occurred. So first off, a low tolerance species, you can almost think of those guys as like specialists. They can't deal with a lot of change. So you have an increase in specialists. That's not bad. You're having more biodiversity. That's not a bad thing. And you got a decrease in high tolerance species. Now this is going to be the opposite. High tolerance. These guys are going to be the generalists. So a decrease in the generalists. That's not necessarily bad, because if you have more of the high or the low tolerance of the specialists, then the generalists are going to die off. Phylogenetic diversity has increased. That's actually a good thing. So basically things are starting to kind of evolve and become a little bit more different. That's a good thing. So the biodiversity of the pond has decreased. That's bad. If the biodiversity decreases, so we start 10 species and then we sample it a couple of years later, we got 5. That's bad, because biodiversity, that's what you're always shooting for. If biodiversity goes down, that's not a good thing. We just talked about that. Adjacent development, that's like next door to something. Adjacent, like your next door neighbor, that kind of thing. Difference between species, community, and ecosystem. All right, a species is like humans or harbor seals or catfish. Like one specific kind of organism, that's a species. Now, a community is where that species lives and all the living things that are interacting. Like the harbor seals interacting with the kelp, which is interacting with the urchins, which is interacting with the sea otters, all the things that are alive. Now, an ecosystem is both the alive and the not alive. So again, the harbor seals and the sea urchins and the otters and the kelp and all that kind of stuff, but it's also like the water temperature, the wind, the weather, the water pH, those kind of things, the dissolved oxygen content. So it's both the living and the non-living in the ecosystem. So why does biodiversity lower in degrees when you move closer to the equator? It doesn't. Because as you move closer to the equator has more sunshine, more precipitation. Typically, there's obviously like the Sahara Desert, but typically, as you're kind of starting to become more and more closer to the equator, it starts to increase. All right, so that whoever answered or asked that, specify that in the other Google form, and I can clarify it if you need. I'd like to go over pioneer species and how they can affect other species. So pioneer species, these are the guys that start the rebuilding, is what it is, or they start the building. Like if we're talking primary succession, they're like the lichens and the mosses. Those guys start it all. Those guys, how they affect the other species, they basically, if those guys aren't there, those guys are literally the ones that make the soil so other things can start living there. Adjacent development, we talked about that already. What are the effects on a population of a separation or shrinking of an ecosystem? So this is basically, we talked about this with island biogeography. Remember the over the hedge? If all of a sudden there's a huge area and then all of a sudden it's just like segmented into a bunch of islands, it's hard for things to get from one to the other. So now instead of a big area, so there can be a lot of niches and a lot of biodiversity, now that area is a lot smaller, so there can't be as much biodiversity in that specific area. There's just not enough like primary production to support life there. So the biodiversity is going to drop. How do you assess the biodiversity of an area? That's basically just taking a sampling of the number and types of species that are there. And what is the measure of biodiversity? It's just simply, honestly, the number. Like we talked about in, it's right there. I almost went away from it. Okay, we're talking about 1 small catfish, 17 benthic invertebrates that represent 10 species. That's how you're measuring biodiversity. You're literally just counting them up. Number 5, Galapagos Islands. I'm not sure what you're asking here. The many finch species of the Galapagos Islands evolved from a single species that immigrated to the islands from the coast of South America. These species differ primarily in beak shape, which is closely related to the type of food each species specializes in eating. Which of the following best explains why each of the finch species on the Galapagos Island evolved to be specialists? Let me take a look real quick. So first off, reduced competition. Right there, that should catch your attention because if there's birds on an island, small islands, lots of competition. Everybody's wanting to survive, so the competition is going to be pretty high. So C's already out of there. Then next one, food resources on the islands are more plentiful and nutrient rich. No, the islands have a lot less. So C and D are already out. Islands are limited food resources, forcing there it is right there. So islands have limited food resources. That's true, forcing species to feed on a small range of food items. So basically, they need to get really good at their job so they can survive. I hope that was what you're asking for number 5. How do you find biodiversity? Like we just talked about, basically count it up. What indicates the ecosystem is near being a climax community? That's basically like the number of species and the types of species aren't really changing. So it's like sedentary or it's stable. Like again, think about like the Olympic National Forest. That's climax community, really stable. Everything's generally kind of staying put right now. What shows an ecosystem has been adversely affected? We talked about that one already. What do you need to know about sustainable farming practices? Not too terribly much. So irrigation types is one of them. So for example, I can't remember if their question was on there. I'm not going to go looking for it, but like, for example, if you need to like save water, if you can go from instead of just like using a whole bunch of sprinklers or drip irrigation to start rotating your crops, that can work. Because basically with crop rotation, you can move around like the things that need more water, put them at the top and kind of like let the runoff kind of go down the hillside from the things that need a lot of water to like a little less water, a little less water, a little less water. So like then you're like just kind of watering the hillside rather than equal amounts on every single strip of crops. That can be a good one. So crop rotation is a very, very good one. The integrated pest management we talked about, that was a good one as well. So instead of having to put out the herbicides and pesticides, we got the barn owls and the gopher snakes and the coyotes. Those guys are taking care of the gophers. So that integrated pest management is really strong. The answer number 10 on the progress check. All right, the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction event was caused when an asteroid impacted Earth approximately 66 million years ago near what is now the Gulf of Mexico. The indirect effects of the impact affected the entire globe. The event resulted in the extinction of nearly 75% of all plant and animal species on Earth, including the majority of dinosaur species. Which of the following likely best describes why most of these species went extinct? So direct effects from the impact? No, because they were talking about right there. The indirect effects impacted the entire globe. So it's not A. Loss of competitors, that's a good thing. If your competition goes away, you're going to thrive, but that's not the case. Okay, increase in genetic diversity, that's not what happened. A whole bunch of guys got killed off. So rapid climate and habitat change. So I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of what's called a nuclear winter. So basically like a big explosion kind of goes up into the atmosphere and basically like you have clouds 24 hours a day for just weeks and weeks and months and years and years. If the sun can't penetrate onto the Earth's surface, no primary productivity happens. The climate's going to change. The habitat's going to change. That's what the big thing right there. Where are we at next? What's the difference between species diversity and genetic diversity? Simply species, the different types of species, and the genetic diversity within one population, or one species, their genetic diversity. So for humans, like height and skin color and hair color and eye color, that's genetic diversity. Difference between the four, we went over that already. Can you go over climax communities and how to identify them? We talked about that already. Can you also go over question number 9 on the multiple choice? Question number 9. All right, so there's the two things right there. The pH at which 50% of the Daphne survived after 2 hours of exposure can be predicted from the data. This pH is close to 2. Okay, so Daphne remaining after 2 hours is right here. So we got 0, 0, now we got 24, 32, and 28. So how many would he start with? He needs to try 40. So we started with 40. After 2 hours, 24 of them were living at 5.3. So if we're talking about 50%, we're looking at how many survived at, or how many, what the pH was when 20 survived. That's basically what we're looking for. So the closest, I would think like 4.7, kind of by just kind of some basic math in my head. That's what I'd be thinking. And then, oh yeah, so there's C, 4.5. That's what I would guess. Because you can see at 3.5, see at 3.20 of them survived. So 3.5, a couple might, but it's not going to be 20. You know, there's 4.5, that's close to the 5.3 pH, where 24 of them were surviving. And side note, your test, Apes loves these kind of graphs, so that's why I put a lot of these on your multiple choice, or excuse me, your progress checks in your test. We talked about Collins community already. What was questions 4, solution, and why? Did we? I think we talked about 4. Did we talk about 4? Yeah, we talked about 4 already. Talk about the number and type of producers present. We need to go to convergent on divergent. Yes. So again, convergent, not related. They start getting more and more and more and more similar. Divergent, like Galapagos finches or Darwin's finches, they start related and they start looking more different. They become specialized in different aspects of the ecosystem. Species diversity and level of disturbance graphs. Levels of disturbance graphs. Is it this one? I'm not sure which one you're talking about on that one. On the other Google form, clarify that question, and I can ask it for you, or answer it for you. Excuse me. Can you go over island geography again? What causes species diversity and higher extinction rates in smaller, more remote islands? Okay. So if you have a big island that's just right off the coast, you know, like 50 feet, obviously it's going to be farther than that, but just kind of for demonstration purposes, if it's right there and it's really huge, it's easy for things to go from the mainland to the island and back if they would like. Plus, it's a big island, it's going to have more resources. So if I put a small island at 50 feet, still the migration pattern is going to be the same, but there's just not as much resources. Now put those at a distance. Big island, that's far away. Once you get to the thing, you could probably live there. There's big things, there's probably a lot of resources, you're going to be okay. But a small island, if you happen to find it far away, and once you get there, if some other guys have already been there, it's going to be hard to kind of like make a living and survive there. So that's why extinction rates on those far off islands that are small is high. Because if you first get there, you're the first dude there, life is wonderful. But then the next guy comes in and you got a little bit of competition, and maybe you've evolved the loss of your your ability to hear really well. So because there's no predators, you've lost that ability. But as more things get out there, the things that are now coming typically have better ability to prey on things. They're stronger predators, so they just go wild. So the far island that's small, lots of species extinction, because basically the next thing to show up typically is a better at fighting than the last thing that's there. All right. Species genetic biodiversity, we talked about that already. What happens in a habitat that has experienced habitat loss or fragmentation? Typically, the biodiversity drops just because there's not enough resources to go around for everybody at that point. Farmers and the fertilizer. Okay. Farmers and the fertilizer. Oh, it's probably right there, number 11. Which of the following techniques is a realistic solution for farmers to decrease the amount of fertilizer and sediment runoff from aquatic ecosystems? So integrated pest management, that's a good idea, but that's not going to do anything with fertilizer, though. Switching from drip irrigation to furrow irrigation, that's also not going to deal with fertilizer, that's dealing with water. Practicing crop rotation, that's really good. So that there's the answer right there. So think to our eco columns. We planted the legumes because those guys add nitrogen. So if you have a field that has 5 different sections and you have one of them that's adding nitrogen, you should move that guy around so he adds nitrogen to your soil all over your farm. That'd be the best idea because it's going to make your soil healthier that way. Different levels of biodiversity. I think we talked about that. What are the effects of the different biodiversities? So if you overall have high species diversity, you're going to have a lot of different things living there. So if something comes, it's going to make the ecosystem basically more resistant to change. Because if something happens and it wipes out a couple of species, let's say you got 30 species living in a forest and something comes through and wipes out 5 of them, you still have 25 species left over. So your ecosystem is going to do okay. But if you have low species diversity, let's say you have 8 species and then something comes through and wipes out 5 of them, there's only 3 left. You're in trouble. All right, so that's the first one, species diversity. Genetic diversity, also a good thing. Okay, I think I've talked about this already, but think of honestly of COVID. There are certain communities and certain types of humans that are just more susceptible to it. Like unfortunately, COVID hits more the Black and the Hispanic community more than the white and the Asian community, and they haven't figured out why. But that's kind of the power of genetic diversity. Certain kind of like people or certain types, the tall versus the short, whatever it is, they're more susceptible or they're stronger to resist certain things. Where are we at now? What is most likely to occur in habitat loss fragmentation? I think we just talked about that. Yeah, like the species diversity is going to go down. What is an ecosystem for service versus a regulating service? So a regulating service, start again. Ecosystem service is kind of like the overarching definition of all the things that the world does for us. A regulating service is just kind of like a thing inside of it. So a regulating service could be something like soil regeneration. It could be the bees pollinating the crops. It could be the bats eat mosquitoes. I hate mosquitoes, so I love that regulating service. That could be a good one. It's basically something that the world does for us that really we don't like have to do ourselves, thankfully. Do we have to know the different types of ecologies? I assume you're meaning ecosystems here. The only thing you're going to need to know is, I don't have it pulled up, but like the free response question had like that graph that had like the different ecosystems with precipitation and temperature, that kind of thing. That's kind of what you need to know. Is when it's really wet, it's really hot, that's tropical rainforest. When it's really cold and really dry, that's the tundra. Like that kind of like if you can interpret that graph, you're going to be okay. Why is biodiversity important? We talked about that. The difference between an ecosystem engineer and a keystone species. Oh, this is a good question. So an ecosystem engineer creates the ecosystem. So like we watched that video on the wolves of Yellowstone where the beaver makes a dam. That dam creates a lake that becomes an ecosystem where the fish and the ducks and all those kind of guys can basically thrive. So they're creating the ecosystem, the physical. And remember, ecosystem is both the living and the non-living. So it's the water that the fish are in. So it's creating all of that. Keystone species, they're the top dog. They're the wolves in Yellowstone. They're the lions in Africa, stuff like that. Okay, their presence makes it so the rest of the food web that's underneath them stays balanced. So they prey on this guy, and so the numbers here don't get out of control. So the numbers of the guy below them don't get out of control, and so on. They kind of like keep the balance going in that ecosystem. Biodiversity of an area, we talked about that. Number 20, solution and why. Which of the following can be used to assess the biological diversity of an area? Population size of each species and the area occupied by each population. So this is just talking about population size, not necessarily diversity. Minimum population area and minimum viable population size, ratio of R strategies to K strategies. Okay, so let's chat about this real quick. So an R strategist, okay, that would be, we talk about mosquitoes, that's an R strategist is a mosquito. They rapidly reproduce. A mosquito can live for about 24 to 48 hours. In that time span, she can lay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of eggs. So that's why, March, hey, nice. The spring is coming. It's beautiful out. And like 3 days later, there's like 50 bazillion mosquitoes. That's why. Okay, they can reproduce really quickly versus a K-selected species. Okay, those guys basically they spend more time like raising their young, like humans. We're K strategists. All right. Number of individuals under 15 years old, number of individuals over 65 years old, genetic variation within each species, number of species present. There it is right there. Following can be used to biological diversity. We're talking genetic variation because we talk about that's one of the real good things for biodiversity, and the number of species present. That's the other type. The main two types, I should say it that way, of figuring out species diversity in an area, or basically the diversity of an area. What is the general idea we need to know on the test? Because what I study isn't on the test. Okay. Biodiversity is important. Island biogeography is important. Knowing niches. Knowing what else is on the test that I should talk about. I think that's basically it. I think. Let me look at the progress check real fast. The convergent, divergent evolution. A couple like things kind of like this where it's more talking about like the ecosystems rather than anything else. Ecological footprint. There's that. Island biogeography. This is kind of the same idea here. Kind of island biogeography. You got the original and it kind of gets segmented apart. That's island biogeography, but more in like a terrestrial lifespan or terrestrial environment. We talk about pH. So this is basically kind of like interpreting data. There's going to be questions like that because the apes does it. So I got to get you guys ready for that stuff. Extinction rate in islands. We talked about that. Can you go over the details of biodiversity, the different ways of measuring it? We talked about that. Only have 2 questions. Okay, I have to delete that one. Why do small, close islands have a greater rate of species extension? We talked about that one. Island question scenario. I think we discovered when are specialists better? Specialists are better when there's high or in areas of high biodiversity, tropical rainforests, tons and tons and tons of different organisms. So you better be the best at that one job that you have, or you're going to be outcompeted. So that's a real good example of where like a generalist, like a rat, he would do pretty good, but like he's good at a lot of things, but he's not an expert in one area. So if he's trying to eat the watermelon, well, this dude over here is so good at it, it's not going to leave very much for the rat to get. And so he goes to the mango, but this guy's really good at getting the mango, and so on, so on, so on. So you need to be really, really, really good at your one job, and that's how you survive. Effects of fragmentation on animals and diversity affected area. We talked about that already. What can be assessed to find the biodiversity? We talked about that already. Genetic variation and typically the number of species are the 2 big ones. All right, so I'm going to post this. I'm also going to post that second Google form to basically like if you need clarification from this, I'll either do Screencastify on Wednesday for you guys to view, or we can view it, and that's going to kind of depend on the number of questions, or we can chat about some stuff Thursday before the test. All righty. See you guys on Wednesday or Thursday, depending on which one you guys, if you guys have me or not. I'll get that out of there.